going to help you revise the urban geography topic. And the first thing I'd like to remind you is that when you're revising this topic, it's also worthwhile to revise the urban geography map skills topic alongside, because the questions that appear in the exam paper on urban geography often have the map skills questions mixed in with them. Now, what I would suggest you do is you make sure you have your revision checklist open and you've looked through it, and that you can tick off each of the key ideas in that checklist and match them to notes in your class file. And your class notes should roughly follow this format. Okay. Another thing that you're going to want to do is have your urban practice questions open. What I suggest you do is you listen to this tutorial and the second part, which is a separate tutorial, which you'll find in the same area, is you have a pad or flashcards, and that you note down each question as I review it, and then you note down the key bullet points as kind of the key ideas that I am suggesting that you would write about. You'll find that many of my ideas match your class notes that you've got in your urban geography topic notes. But it's worthwhile pausing this at each stage as I start a new question, and then thinking about what I've just said and the key points, and then move on to the next question. So let's get started. Let's look at questions that focus on the CBD. There's really kind of two questions that you're going to see. What are the problems? And that's this first question. And what are the possible solutions to the problems? And I'll talk more about that in detail. So let's look at this particular question here. With reference to a city you have studied in the developed world, and that's kind of important because that means straight away you're going to talk about Glasgow. Describe the different problems that exist. Now, because this question says describe, you're just needing to tell me what they are. You're not needing to explain why they exist. If this says explain the different problems, well, then you have to tell me about the problem, and you then need to give me a reason why it exists as a problem. Now, in this question, like a lot of urban geography, you get some kind of resource that's going to help you answer it. And in this case, we've got a photograph of a CBD, and we've got some points around the edge. Now, let's just think about the different problems that exist that we can see in this photo. So we have a lack of space because every area has been developed. The reason for that, if we were to explain it, is because people want to build in this area of the city because it's most accessible, and therefore they've used all of the space that currently exists. Another problem is pollution. If we were to explain the problem of pollution, we could explain that that's largely to do with the high number of cars in the city centre, which are starting and stopping all the time because of congestion, which leads to high levels of pollution, which then affects people's health. We could talk about traffic congestion. Why do we have traffic congestion? Well, we have it because there's lots of cars, but second of all, because there are lots of traffic lights, and because of the grid street pattern in the city centre. That's why we need traffic lights, because cars are crossing each other all the time. But of course, what that does is it means that vehicles are continually starting and stopping. Okay. Now, we have other things here that aren't relating to problems. So if we just think in general about some other problems in the city centre, we have overcrowded pavements because of the sheer volume of people, making it slow to get around. We have another big problem where businesses are leaving and moving out to the edge of the cities, like to shopping centres like Bray Head, which means that shops in the town centres are starting to struggle to stay open, and people are therefore no longer visiting the city centre because all of the shops are on the outskirts. Another problem is the danger. Because of the high volume of vehicles, city centres can be quite dangerous, especially for young families with young children who might potentially get hit. And a final problem that you could talk about is the fact that it's very expensive to rent buildings in the city centre, which means that a lot of businesses can't afford to operate in the city centre any longer. So that's a whole bunch of reasons about the problems. Now, it's quite important to be aware of what the problems are, because you may be asked to talk about solutions, which is this next question. When we look at it, it asks, it's very similar, these two questions here are very similar to each other. In this case, it's for Glasgow or any other developed world city you've studied, explain the main changes that have taken place in the CBD. So that's the key idea you want to write down. Explaining the changes is very similar to telling me about the solutions. Because obviously, if you think about the problems I outlined in the first question, what have they done to resolve those problems? So let's think about, I'll come up with 6 or 7 quick changes that have happened in the CBD and refer them to these photographs that in this particular question have been given as a little help for you to answer the question. Now, because it says it wants you to talk about a city, you need to start your answer with in Glasgow. And the first change is that they have built large indoor shopping malls like the Buchanan Galleries. And if you were to explain that, you would then say the reason for that is because it means people are more likely to want to come to the city centre, especially when it's raining, because there's somewhere indoor to go, and it means that they're less likely to go to places like Bray Head, which have been drawing people away from the city centre. And this means that shops are able to stay open in the city centre because there's now malls. Another change is that old buildings have been converted, like we can see here. Why is that happening? Well, in Glasgow city centre, it's to make the city centre more attractive, which means more shoppers are going to come in. It also keeps the heritage of the area going, so the area looks interesting and different because it's got a lot of the old buildings still in place. So it means tourists are going to be interested in visiting the centre. We've got expensive designer stores. Now, this was on Ingram Street. We actually saw this on our trip. So what's the change in Glasgow happening here? So old buildings, once again, have been converted, but this time they're being converted in a way that attracts high-end retailers, which then provide shopping experiences for people with a lot of money to come into the city centre, and that means a lot of money is being spent. Okay, some of the other changes that have gone on is they pedestrianised Buchanan Street. If you were to explain that, you would say it's because 2 things. It takes traffic away from this road, which means the road is safer, and pedestrians are more likely, therefore, want to come to the city centre. Second of all, because traffic's now been removed from this street, there's less pollution and noise, and therefore, once again, it's a nicer shopping environment, which means people are more likely to want to come here to spend their money. Okay, other changes that have happened are to do with they've built more high-rise buildings in the city centre. This is to attract both hotel chains as well as companies who can then locate in the CBD, large energy companies like Scottish Power. And why are they high-rise? Because it means that they use the land, the limited amount of land, effectively by building up the way, and large companies therefore can be drawn in because there's lots of office space by these high-rise buildings. Other changes that have happened in the city centre include adding lots of street lighting and cameras, CCTV cameras. The reason for that is to make people feel safer in the evening, which means that they're more likely to shop later on and maybe even come back to the city centre to eat out. And a final change you could refer to would be the building of the concert hall at the top of Buchanan Street. And the reason they did that was to encourage people to come in the evening to socialise, to go and see music concerts and things like that going on in the city centre, which means they're also probably going to spend money at restaurants, and therefore more people are going to be in the town centre. So I've given you a list of about 7 changes. You want to maybe review them, note them all down. And the key thing in this answer was I actually referred to specific examples, and one of your 5 marks will always come from referring to a specific named example from a city you've studied. Now, this last question is a little bit different because it is focused on solutions, but this time it wants you to talk about transport and how the solutions work for the CBD. So let's just quickly review some transport solutions in the CBD. Okay, the first one is that they have built lots of bus-only lanes. This means the buses can travel through the city centre quicker, which means people are more likely to use the bus rather than take their own car. And that means there's going to be less cars on the road, which is going to help reduce congestion and also make the environment cleaner. So I would pause at this point and note those little chain of events that happens because you're building bus lanes. Okay, second solution is on Buchanan Street, they have built an access point to the tube. The reason for that is because they want to encourage people to use the underground to come into the city centre, which is a much more environmentally friendly way to get into the city centre than using their car, which would also create traffic and parking problems if they were bringing their car. Especially, it's also been built on Buchanan Street because people are much more likely to use the train if they're arriving right in the middle of the centre. A third solution is they built lots of multi-storey car parks. Reason for that is that means there's less people parking on the sides of roads, which widens the amount of space for cars to drive on and therefore reduces congestion. A fourth solution is they've used lots of